Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar series of European Students for Liberty. I'm Nick Roskams. I'll be the moderator this evening. And please allow me to introduce ESFL to those of you who maybe are not as familiar with us. Um, ESFL is a spin-off of Students for Liberty in the US, which started in 2008. And we got started in 2011 with a European executive board. And our goal is to provide backup and support for student organizations and students throughout Europe. We do this via a variety of ways through free books, these webinars, of course, conferences, and all kinds of resources that we try to bring to students around Europe. If you want to learn more about ESFL and SFL in general, feel free to visit our website at studentsforliberty.org, where you can learn a lot more about what we are doing. And of course, we're always interested in libertarian students, libertarian student groups who could use our assistance. If there's anything we can do for you, we are at your service, so feel free to contact us. Tonight's webinar will feature a philosopher's guide to the Eurozone crisis, a very hot topic in these days. And we have an excellent speaker, Professor Stefan Auer, who is a Jean Monnet Chair in EU Interdisciplinary Studies and an Associate Professor in History and Politics at La Trobe University in Australia. He is the author of Whose Liberty Is It Anyway? Europe at the Crossroads. And tonight he will be giving a talk on the Eurozone crisis and the ideas that shaped it. So without further ado, I give you Professor Stefan Auer. And during the talk, you can post your questions in the question tab you will find in the panel. So if you got remarks or questions, then just post them there. And after the talk is over, which should be about 40 to 45 minutes, we will be able to hand those to Professor Auer. Professor, you have the floor.
Okay, here I am. Can you hear me? Yeah? Thanks, Nick, for your kind introduction, and thank indeed for inviting me and organizing all this. It's an exciting opportunity for me. I must admit that I've never presented a webinar, so this is all new to me. Nick mentioned that I'm based at La Trobe University in Melbourne, but I'm giving this talk from Helsinki. I'm in Finland on a research trip. And this is just as well because the time difference would be very bad if that was happening from Melbourne. But I'm still a bit jet lagged. I only arrived yesterday, so I hope I'll do okay. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you because I share your passion for liberty. So I think the entire organization is an excellent idea. As someone who grew up in a communist country, I grew up in communist Czechoslovakia, I never take liberty for granted, and neither should you. But I'm going to talk about the Eurozone crisis, and I want to present you with a couple of reflections that are inspired by some of the influential philosophers that shaped my thinking about politics. The Eurozone crisis, you see, is not just about economics, though economics matters a great deal. To my mind, what Europe is facing is the most profound crisis of European democracy, both at the EU level and at the national level. The way in which this crisis is addressed or not addressed will decisively shape future Europe. So what I want to ask in this presentation is what we can learn from a handful of philosophers about the current crisis and its likely outcome. And I do not have any kind of ready-made answers. I don't even claim all that much expertise on all the thinkers I'll mention. I simply want to invite you to think about the EU's problems from various perspectives that some of the best minds developed over the last 3 centuries or so. So I'll start with a very brief overview, something like 3 centuries of political thought in 3 minutes on 3 slides, and discuss in eternity, so that's nothing but ambitious. And then I will discuss in more detail about the current challenges. But you have to be forgiving. That is, the survey I'll present you with is rather schematic and somewhat superficial. It is to set the scene. So here are the first 2 characters I want to introduce. I mean, you will all have heard about Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I think they are useful for us today because of the conflicting views about sovereignty. Now, I grouped them together, even though they are not contemporaries, but they had influential views on sovereignty and international order. Hobbes, of course, is famous for his Leviathan, in which he conceived sovereignty as indivisible. This was one of his key insights. Facing a massive crisis, that was the English Civil War, he pondered the importance of authority. And the solution he came up with might not be all that palatable to us today, but it has its own compelling logic. To prevent anarchy and perpetual war, Hobbes argued you need a Leviathan that is more powerful than anyone or any group of people within a state. So for Hobbes, sovereignty was indivisible. Jean-Jacques Rousseau saw it differently, of course. He contemplated already in the 18th century the possibility of sovereignty shared, which is, of course, something that the EU prides itself on now. And then in terms of international order, for Hobbes, you could, you could ensure peace within a country once you accept the power of the sovereign. But as for the international order, that will always be characterized by anarchy and the proclivity to war, while for Rousseau it was possible and desirable to establish an international order that would lead to something like an eternal peace. Which brings me to the next duo that I want to introduce, and that is Immanuel Kant, and I contrast Immanuel Kant with Niccolo Machiavelli. And again, you see they are not contemporaries, far from it. They are about 3 centuries apart, but their conflicting views about political legitimacy and political authority, again, have been influential to this day. So I talked about Rousseau and his idea of shared sovereignty and the possibility of eternal peace. But of course, it is Kant who is perhaps better known as the author of the Perpetual Peace and as that classic liberal thinker who contemplated the possibility of peace between republics. You see, Rousseau understood that there are limits as to how much that ideal can be accomplished, because he knew that the rulers were going to be selfish and therefore would not necessarily pursue what is in the interest of the people. And Kant dealt with that problem by talking about the peace amongst republics. So for Kant, it is possible and desirable to have political legitimacy derived on the basis of people consenting to being ruled, and the rule of law is important for Kant. In contrast, Machiavelli is less optimistic about that possibility, and he believed that the most effective and lasting rule can be accomplished through power that is based on the threat of violence. So while for Kant, political legitimacy must be based on consent of those who are ruled, Machiavelli believed that man was fickle, and to base one's rule on popularity is a doomed enterprise. Bribing the people with gifts costs money, and sooner or later rulers would run out of money and will be neither loved nor respected, which again is something that has resonance with contemporary crises in Europe. I'll come back to it. So for Machiavelli, a prudent ruler relies on fear rather than love, because love is unsustainable as an emotion in politics. As I said, this is very schematic, and we can discuss it further later on, or I will develop it further in my written work, but this is just to set the scene. And the scene for the conventional story of European integration. But let me just give you one more quote by Rousseau that goes back to 1756, and there Rousseau sounds almost prophetic. Realize this Commonwealth of Europe for a single day, and you may be sure it will last forever. So fully would experience convince men that their own gain is to be found in the good of all. This is the idea of perpetual peace that Kant basically developed later on, that in a commonwealth of republics where people rule themselves, they also realize that it is in their interest to live peacefully with their neighbors. And once that is made possible, you know, then it will last forever, Rousseau said. Again, Rousseau was not necessarily as optimistic about that outcome as that quote suggests, but that is what is behind the conventional story of European integration. It is the story that's very Kantian or Rousseau inspired, if you want. And that's the way that the story has been presented also by contemporary thinkers like the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, who likes to view the EU in that way. And in good times, this story is plausible. Rousseau, Kant, and Jürgen Habermas could reliably guide us through the first couple of decades of European integration. They were good weather guys. But the times are more difficult now, and I think we will need other guides that are introduced. Let me just expand a bit more on Immanuel Kant and his notion of perpetual peace. Again, Kant was much more nuanced and realistic than this shorter overview will allow us to present. But one of the things that even Kant was worried about was that too much centralization is not desirable, that in fact it can be dangerous. And that is why what he advocated was a Völkerbund, not a Völkerstaat. And that means he was in favor of a community of nations, but not a supranational state. He warned against a universal monarchy that would descend first to despotism and then to anarchy. So even Kant was much more wary of the feasibility of this project than is commonly recognized. He warned against the danger of both excessive centralization as well as fragmentation. In fact, Kant went so far as to praise nature for dividing mankind into nations which differ in their languages as well as religions. Such diversity will prevent them from melting into one large and unyieldly universal monarchy, or the universal monarchy, which is bound to descend first to despotism and then to anarchy. What Kant advocated, therefore, was a Völkerbund, as I said, not a Völkerstaat. Now, the question that follows from this to contemporary Europe is simple. How much unity is desirable for the EU to work? How far can centralization proceed without endangering democracy? That's the key question. And going back to Rousseau, we could say that the Commonwealth of Europe worked remarkably well for the first couple of decades or so. And that brings me now to the project of European unification, European project, if you will. So the Commonwealth of Europe worked remarkably well for the first couple of decades or so. To be more precise, there were the years which the influential economic historian Alan Milward described as the European rescue of the nation state. Integration really appeared a win-win proposition initially, bringing about palpable political and economic benefits that vastly outweighed most disadvantages, whether perceived or real. So let me just, again, in a very schematic way, present the European project. I teach a subject about the European Union that is entirely available on iTunes U, so I would just direct you towards those sources. But let me give you a very sketchy outline that helps me to develop further arguments. The project of European unity was informed by the terrible experience of the Second World War, the rise of Nazism, Fascism, Stalinism, Communism. It was directed against those isms. And the key dates, of course, are 1951, the European Coal and Steel Community, and then the creation of the European Economic Community in 1957 through the Treaty of Rome. Now, the more liberal project is the one that goes back to the Treaty of Rome, 1957. And in some ways, as I said, the project was informed by the experience of the terrible war, and it was pragmatic in its nature. So even the leading figure, Jean Monnet, the bureaucrat, who was pragmatic enough to understand that the project of European unity must advance in small steps. And as I mentioned, Alan Milward described the nature of that project in his path-breaking study, The European Rescue of the Nation State, and that title actually captures the essence of it in the early stage. That is, the project was not directed against nation states, but in fact, it empowered nation states to regain control over their destiny through working together with other nation states. It was mostly about creating the common market and enabling the nations of Europe after the devastation of the Second World War to become prosperous again through joint efforts. Now, something unexpected happened. As I said, the project was directed against Nazism, against fascism, against descent to barbarism that the Second World War meant to Europe. But it was also directed against the Stalinist regimes in Eastern Europe and against the spread of communism from Eastern Europe. And this is how Europe then radically changed in 1989. Of course, I'm talking about the collapse of communism, and two revolutions occurred, triggered through 1989 in a way. One is, of course, the collapse of communism, the Velvet Revolution, but another one is seldom referred to as a revolution. I talk about the Maastricht Treaty revolution in my book, because what happened is partly inspired by the 1989 revolution. Elites in Western Europe, intoxicated by a victory that wasn't theirs, European federalists pushed Europe further towards their ideal of a United States of Europe. So the steps that were made between 1989 and 1993, and that led to the Treaty of Maastricht, that created the legal basis for the creation of the single currency, those steps were revolutionary. Building on a revolution that was not a revolution, the implosion of communism in 1989, Western Europe embarked on a Maastricht Treaty revolution, which promised to give Europe even more unity and power in an increasingly globalized world. So it is not without irony that just when Eastern Europe succeeded in freeing itself from the stronghold of one delusional ideology, communism, Western Europe bought into a peculiar ideology of European integration. I really would talk from that point in time about a kind of EU ideology that captured the imagination of West European elites. And this is what happened, again, presented in a schematic way, that while in the early stages of the project, it was pragmatic, and the founding fathers, including people like Konrad Adenauer, the Chancellor of West Germany, and Robert Schuman, the French foreign minister, and Jean Monnet, whom I mentioned, they understood that there were limits to European unity. They didn't build a supranational state. Some of them might have had ambitions in that direction, Jean Monnet, for example, but they're pragmatic enough to understand that they cannot work against the existing national democracies. And I think that is where a shift occurred after 1989, that increasingly European elites believed that the entire project has to be basically directed not only against the catastrophes or to ensure the prevention of such catastrophes as was the Second World War, but that the project has to be directed against nation states. So the new ideology of EU federalism is based on the misconceived idea that nationalism is to be blamed for all the disasters that occurred in 20th century Europe. I would just remind you of the fact that it wasn't nationalism that destroyed Europe. Nazism fascism, Stalinism destroyed it, and in fact, national liberation was needed to destroy first Nazism and then indeed even communism in Central and Eastern Europe. So the idea that nationalism was bad and nation states need to be somehow surpassed led to the introduction of the single currency, which was meant to accelerate that process. But what was meant to bring about the end of European nation states, I will argue, will bring about the end of European unity, because this is one of the key paradoxes of the single currency, that a project that was meant to cement European unity forever after is now destroying trans-European solidarity and ultimately also European unity. You see, there is one connection between 1989, the Velvet Revolution in Central Europe, and the Maastricht Treaty Revolution, and that connection goes through Germany. That is, German unity was resisted amongst the partners of Germany, including France. And so a trade-off was negotiated, as you probably know, between France and Germany, between Helmut Kohl and President Mitterrand, where Germans were asked to give up on their beloved German mark. In exchange, French accepted German unity. Now, what Germans were promised was, of course, that they would get a currency that would be as strong, as dependable, as reliable as German mark used to be. And the German Bundesbank was meant to have the qualities, sorry, the European Central Bank was meant to inherit the qualities of the German Bundesbank. That is, that it would be apolitical, independent, and committed to price stability. And that is, of course, what is now being undermined. But the key point of that outline for me is that in the first 3 decades of European unity or so, the project was characterized by pragmatism. It was not about abolishing the nation state, even if some of the actors might have had those ambitious aims. And it is only through that radical break that was partly made possible through the collapse of communism in 1989 that project gained a much more ambitious scope. And its ultimate aim was, in a way, to destroy nation states. And so it is because of that radical nature of the single currency that Thatcher opposed its introduction. This is why she objected against further erosion of British parliamentary sovereignty, and why she fought when the opportunity arose after 1989 for a wider Europe as a common market, rather than a deeper and smaller Europe as a fully fledged political federation. You see, that is one of the aspects of the Maastricht Treaty, that it deepened the European Union, but it also delayed the entry of the countries, of nations that freed themselves from communism. So the enlargement of the European Union took place only in 2004, a long time after that. So Europe faces a massive crisis. And this is why we no longer, we can no longer rely on Kant, Rousseau, and Habermas. In exceptional times, we need thinkers who thought about exceptional times. And that is when I invoke the ghost of Carl Schmitt. And I introduce you to the last couple in my presentation, and that is Carl Schmitt versus Jürgen Habermas. I already mentioned Habermas, but I didn't talk about Carl Schmitt. There are 2 titanic figures, if you want, in German political thought. And again, as a schematic kind of contrast between the 2. So as I said, until recently, when the EU appeared to be the United States of Europe in the making, it made sense to read thinkers like Kant and Habermas. The project was meant to be driven by the ideals of cosmopolitan citizenship and perpetual peace through conversation. No longer. The times are no longer good, and we need Hobbes, Machiavelli, and Carl Schmitt to come to grips with what's going on. Now, why Carl Schmitt? He is one of the great 20th century thinkers who pondered the contradictions that liberal democracy faces, the contradiction between liberty and the need for authority, for example, the contradiction between democracy and liberalism. Carl Schmitt understood that at the heart of politics was conflict. Jürgen Habermas is trying to move away from conflicts through his concept of the communicative reason. Carl Schmitt understood that ultimately politics is above law, while for Jürgen Habermas, as a good Kantian, Rechtsstaat was above politics. Carl Schmitt pondered the state of emergency and talked about exception. Habermas, of course, focused on post-war normality. He's the philosopher of post-war normality. Carl Schmitt believed, like Hobbes did, that sovereignty is indivisible, while Jürgen Habermas advocates the concept of pooled sovereignty for a post-national Europe. Now, I need to say a few words about Carl Schmitt because he is a hugely controversial thinker. He was initially a defender of liberal democracy in Weimar Republic, but became its mortal enemy. He was a brilliant constitutional scholar who ended up employing his unsurpassed sophistication to support Nazism. He was expansively cosmopolitan in his outlook, yet created justification for the narrow, even racially defined extreme nationalism of Hitler's Germany. Yet for all his appalling lack of judgment in 1933, when he was enlisted to support the Nazis, basically, and after, Schmitt thought deeply about all the fundamental problems that Europe needs to urgently address now. What is the relationship between law and politics, between liberalism and democracy, between politics and economics? How can we prevent the rule of technocracy? So Schmitt was a profound political thinker. Needless to say, we must find a number of Schmitt's substantive arguments objectionable. Some of his solutions were clearly appalling. In other words, this is not an attempt to rehabilitate the crown jurist of Nazi Germany. And I should really stress that my idea is not to rehabilitate Carl Schmitt. It is rather an invitation to think with Schmitt, against Schmitt, and to think about contemporary problems in Europe with Carl Schmitt. He was the philosopher of the state of emergency. He thought normality was boring. He was more interested in the exception. Does anyone doubt that Europe faces exceptional challenges? Of course it does. So as I said, Carl Schmitt, to my mind, is becoming more interesting as a thinker and potentially much more useful for us when we ponder the problems of Eurozone. Again, as I said, there are no doubts. I mean, whether you support the way in which the EU crisis is handled, whether you support the vision of an ever closer union, or whether you are against it, there are no doubts that Eurozone crisis is getting out of control. I mean, that was the Economist magazine cover from 2 years ago, I think, and the horror has not declined, and it became even more pronounced. So this is why Schmitt is important for us. Schmitt defined sovereign as the one who decides on the exception. So he thought about the problem of sovereignty. He exposed the weaknesses of a purely formalistic conception of the Rechtsstaat during the Weimar Republic. And he believed that a constitution is the expression of the political community of a nation. I mean, again, that is just a very schematic outline of some of the key points of Carl Schmitt. There is an excellent book by Jan Werner Müller that was published, I think, just last year, that deals with the political ideas in 20th century Europe, but also deals in great detail with the German experience. And one of the key ideas that Miller presents there is the idea of constrained democracy. That is, Europeans, particularly in Germany, after the Second World War, the German elites realized that well, they learned their lessons from the collapse of Weimar Republic, and they accepted that there must be constitutional constraints on democracy. That is a strange feature of German post-Second World War political culture, or in fact the political system that was created there, that it has, if you want, institutionalized suspicion of the people, and for a good reason. For example, referendum in Germany is unconstitutional because Germans had such bad experience with referendum during the Weimar Republic. So the German political system, if you want, is suspicious of people, and that is why Germany has also always been, or German elites have always been very pro-European and rather at ease with the idea of sovereignty being shared. That was yet another constraint on their national democracy, and this is, as I said, very nicely described in Werner Müller's book. Now, I'm saying that also because one of the new innovations that have been negotiated as a part of the Eurozone crisis management is very German and suits that concept of a constrained democracy, and that is Schuldenbremse, or the debt brake. You see, that is one of the many problems of the management of the crisis, that the solution that seems perfectly plausible in one political culture is much harder to implement in another country, in another political culture. Debt brake is definitely one of those solutions. So debt brake was introduced in Germany, but then Germans negotiated in the fiscal pact, which is the latest agreement that the Europeans reached, that it should be applied across the Eurozone, or in fact across Europe. And you know that all the countries apart from the UK and the Czech Republic accepted the fiscal pact. But can it work? Well, if you take Carl Schmitt seriously, he will tell you that it cannot, because in politics, in politics, the situation in the case of emergency arises where countries, political leaders no longer respect the rules of law, right? This is something that Germans should understand better than anyone, precisely because of their experience with the Weimar Republic, precisely because of the insights that Carl Schmitt developed back then, but partly because of German experience with post-war, post-Second World War normality and political stability that was based on a very strong commitment to the rule of law. They kind of forgot about that. So I think it is quite the German illusion to think that when you have debt brake introduced in constitutions across Europe, the problem with debt will be eradicated. Politics doesn't work like that. It's simple as that. Now, I mentioned already that Carl Schmitt describes sovereignty, or sovereign, as the one who decides on the exception. That's a profound statement. And I think it is profoundly relevant for us today. In some ways, you could ask yourself, or the entire management or mismanagement of the Eurozone crisis is about the location of sovereignty. Who is sovereign in the current crisis? Let me give you some suggestions. Or where is sovereign? Is it in Frankfurt? Is it in Brussels? Is it in Berlin, Paris, Rome, Athens? Who is it? Angela Merkel, François Hollande, Draghi, Monti? You see all the names and places. Now, the surprising thing is, well, Frankfurt, because of the European Central Bank and considering the major decision that they just took, you may well argue that Mario Draghi is one of the most powerful or influential actors who decides on emergency. Sovereign is the one who decides on emergency. That means that that person decides when an emergency occurs, and that person also decides what is to be done in that case. So Mario Draghi really appears to be an actor of such supranational power, or supranational, whatever you want. Yet, right now, it's more like sovereignty lies in Karlsruhe, because that is the seat of the German Constitutional Court. And it's rather unfortunate that I'm presenting this just the night before the decision will be announced about the constitutionality of the European Stability Mechanism and the Fiscal Pact, because complaints were made about it being incompatible with the German constitution. Now, the German Constitutional Court has a long history of being pro-European with some reservations. So the first two decisions are called Solange 1, Solange 2, because they say that whatever steps the European Union took towards an ever closer union, they are fine and compatible with the project of European unity, as long as they do this and that. Yeah. Again, I can't go into much detail. This is just, again, a schematic outline. But the key decisions that are important still today are the Maastricht Treaty decision and the Lisbon Treaty decision. And if the court says, as is likely to do, that the European Stability Mechanism is fine, then they will have to contradict what they stated in the justification of the Maastricht Treaty decision, when they stipulated clearly that it must remain within the power of the Bundestag, the German parliament, to decide on areas that matter to Germany, that are of utmost importance, like finances. And of course, the European Stability Mechanism undermines that capability significantly. And the key issues that were decided on in all these decisions is who is the folk, who are the people that legitimize the German political system, and that's a very Schmittian question, actually. And how long is eternity? Now, this is a funny idea that, again, is Schmittian in its nature. That is, Carl Schmitt understood that the weakness of Weimar Republic and the constitution that it had consisted in it not being clearly, explicitly enough about the ultimate value that underpins that republic. And this is the lesson that the drafters of the post-Second World War German constitution learned. So they made a very clear, unambiguous, and a very strong commitment to the fundamental political value that underpins the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and that was the commitment to democracy. That is the so-called eternity clause in the German constitution, that is in the Article 79, that states explicitly that there mustn't be any changes ever made to the basic political system that West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, or the Unified Germany has created. Now, the funny irony of the eternity clause is that the eternity clause is contained in the Grundgesetz, which is the basic law. Germany still doesn't have a constitution. It is only basic law that was meant to be then abolished and replaced with something more permanent, was Germany was to be reunified. So the idea was that there would be a new constitution for a new Germany. But that didn't happen when Germany unified. Instead, an article was included in the German constitution that made even a stronger commitment to Europe, Germany's commitment to Europe, than was initially the case. The funny thing is that if the court decides tomorrow, announces tomorrow at 10 a.m. on September the 12th, 2012, that the European Stability Mechanism is not compatible with the German constitution, the only avenue that German politicians have that they can pursue if they want to continue in the Eurozone rescue policies is to give Germany a new constitution for which a referendum would be required. So the German Constitutional Court, perhaps, is the sovereign in the European system right now. Now, I said that the consideration of where sovereignty is a handy tool of pondering where Europe is at, or what is Europe's future, or how the Eurozone crisis can or shall be dealt with. Because those people who argue that the only way to overcome the current crisis is to turn Europe into a true federation, a United States of Europe, are basically arguing that sovereignty has to move from nation states to Brussels, or wherever they want to locate it, to a supranational body, whether it be European Commission, European Central Bank, whatever, a supranational organization. I don't think that that solution is desirable. I don't think it's workable. I don't think it is going to help Europe. I would argue that the only way to rescue Europe from itself is to nationalize, renationalize a democracy and return sovereignty where it belongs to nation states. There was a moment where that could have happened when Papandreou, the former Greek prime minister, asked or suggested that there would be a referendum on the Eurozone policies in Greece, but of course he was not allowed to go ahead with it. But I think that contest is not yet settled, so we don't know yet where Europe's future is or what it will be. I think what is clear, though, is that the policies that have been implemented so far have not worked. And I think that it was fallacious to think that Europe's unity will be cemented through the single currency. It produced exactly the opposite. And in the same way, it is crazy to think that more unity will produce a better Europe, where that hubristic belief in the possibility of moving away from nation states, moving away from national currencies, moving away from nations keeping control over their finances, when that belief will basically destroy Europe. Which brings me to Margaret Thatcher, who was proven right. You remember, I said she objected against the single currency. And whoever studied the development when the Maastricht Treaty was negotiated and the British objections against it would have made the same conclusion, well, if not 20 years ago, then at least 2 years ago. I started actually writing opinion pieces for the Australian newspaper more than 2 years ago, and I argued already then that it was the most profound crisis Europe faced, and that in order to rescue European unity, the European elites needed to abandon the failed project and focus on the restoration of European unity rather than focusing on the preservation of the single currency that is ultimately destroying Europe's unity. The funny thing is, though, that even Angela Merkel was proven right, but in a way that she didn't intend. She has said repeatedly that if the euro fails, European unity will fail too. Well, that is becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the euro failed already 2 years ago, or if you want, it was never going to succeed. It was obvious for Thatcher and others that it was a failed project from the moment it was conceived. But so what Merkel says is becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the euro has failed, And the European elites, instead of trying to restore European unity, waste their political capital, and have wasted a tremendous amount of their political capital and an insane amount of money on a project that is doomed. So there we are. I have one more slide. EU's demise in 7 steps. How are we going with time, Nick? Can I talk for a couple more minutes, or should we open up the discussion?
There aren't too many
you hear me?
questions. There aren't too many questions that have come in yet, so I think you're free to talk for 2 or 3 minutes. And I would remind
Okay.
everyone that they can still post their questions under the question tab.
Okay. So here we go. EU's demise in 7 steps. Eurozone crisis has accelerated Europe's economic decline. I mean, Europe has declined globally for the last 10 or 20 years. That is the proportion of the global GDP. Europe's proportion has become smaller. But the problems of the Eurozone have accelerated economic decline. And that has direct implications, of course, on democratic legitimacy. That is, democratic governments find it difficult to maintain political authority, both at national and EU level. That leads to the rise of populism and extreme nationalism. Now, the Eurozone crisis management has failed abysmally. I mean, one thing that I think was obvious already 2 years ago, but it's becoming even worse, is that the material interests of the member states are on a collision course. So what seems like a good idea, say Mario Draghi's policy, ECB's action, what might seem as a good idea for Spain, Italy, Greece, in Germany is perceived as a very bad idea, and that is because the material interests of most Germans are on a collision course with the material interests of Spaniards. Now, what I haven't talked enough about, and I should have, because I wanted it to be about Carl Schmitt and his understanding of the way in which law and politics interact, is that any number of steps that were taken throughout the Eurozone crisis severely undermined what Germans call the Rechtsstaat, and what in English can be translated loosely as the rule of law. Rechtsstaat is more clearly defined than the rule of law, because the word also has the word Staat in it, so that is a state that is underpinned by the rule of law. And the EU, from the outset, was conceived as a supranational state of law, influenced to a large extent by Immanuel Kant. So it's a textbook wisdom about European integration, that what keeps Europe together is law. And the Maastricht Treaty was violated even before the crisis occurred, but over the last 2 years, the Maastricht Treaty has been violated more ruthlessly, if you want, including by the European Central Bank, that abandoned its political independence. I mean, the last step, the announcement by Mario Draghi that the ECB will be buying bonds basically without any limit, is a clear violation of its political independence. And that leads to the destruction of European solidarity. I mean, the talk about transnational solidarity is well, really rather hypocritical in a situation where the member states that were more prudent in their fiscal policies have to subsidize those that were more reckless, regardless of their overall GDP. So we are in a situation where my homeland, Slovakia, has to de facto subsidize Greece, Spain, Ireland, Portugal. All these countries are far richer in terms of their per capita GDP. Even Greece is about 3 times richer in terms of their per capita GDP than Slovakia. And ultimately, that leads to the destruction of European unity. So that's a gloomy outlook for Europe, the way I see it. And I'd like to finish with a comment, with a quote actually, by an Irish writer who wrote in English and French, Samuel Beckett, who understood better than anyone, perhaps, the perennial problem of our fragile predicament. Beckett said, fail, fail again, fail better. Apply to Europe. Well, it's not all too optimistic. It's bound to fail, but how it fails matters a great deal. So I think it would be preferable for European elites to accept that the Eurozone is a failed experiment, and they should focus on the restoration of European unity rather than devoting their energy and insane amount of money into the preservation of the single currency. Well, thanks for your attention, and I'm now happy to talk, to get questions. How does it work now, Nick?
Thank you very much, Stefan.
Do we still anyone? Yeah.
I've received a few questions in the question tab. The first question is from Felipe, who asks, if the EU will become more like a United States of Europe, is there not a layer of government, the national one, which would become redundant, especially in countries like Spain and the UK, where the central government is already an arbiter between the elements which make up the nation? Would it not be logical under a United States of Europe to do away with the government in Madrid, London, etc., and have Edinburgh, Barcelona, Donostia be the capitals of those new countries? So I think this is a hypothetical question.
Interesting. That you would then empower regions and bypass national governments. To be honest, I really think that the idea of a truly federal United States of Europe is reckless, crazy. It's never going to work. I mean, what the single currency, what the Eurozone crisis also shows is that currency is not just a technical instrument. It is the expression of one's political identity, if you want. It also contains conflicting political cultures. So, you know, it's not only an economic argument about optimal currency areas, which was disregarded, and we see the consequences. So countries that have such radically different economic potential cannot be kept together in a single currency. There is also a problem about different political cultures. So for Germans, for example, after the Second World War, the threat of inflation or the fear of inflation is just so pronounced that they can never be in agreement with Spaniards or Italians or Greeks about what is a tolerable level of inflation. And so the Maastricht Treaty was meant to deal with that problem by instituting legally what that level is allowed to be, you know, no more than 3%, and that is what the ECB is meant to follow. But of course, in reality, that has been more or less disregarded. I mean, I'm moving away from your question. The question was whether you should get rid of national governments. Well, I think it would be crazy. You know, democracy is an imperfect project, but we know that it can kind of work within nation states. At EU level, it is not going to work. I mean, even that last step that occurred, it's the least of all the institutions that the EU has, the least democratic institution that now took this decisive step, the European Central Bank, and that is why it is laughable to say that the ECB is politically independent. This was a political step, and the ECB will be deciding, you know, how the countries, how the governments are to act. Yeah, so that is a massive erosion of democracy. It will no longer matter who you vote for when you are in Spain or Greece or Portugal, because you have to comply with what the IMF and the ECB says you need to do as a country. So at some stage, I think the whole thing will fall apart, and that is when the peoples in this country regain control over the destiny through a referendum or through some rebellion or through some chaos caused by extremist parties gaining more control. So I didn't give you a satisfactory answer to that, but my answer is no, it shouldn't move to EU level and the regions. The regions would not be powerful enough to withstand the centralizing pressure coming from the EU.
Okay, next question is from Michael, and he asks, it seems to me that a pan-European political unity is just as subject to the eventual emergence of the sort of transcendent myth that has triggered some of the most difficult troubles of recent centuries. In other words, a European state is not constitutionally different than nation states it subsumes. Is this an accurate view? And if so, why do those who push for an EU state not see that theirs is a different state? It's only a difference of scale.
Yeah, they're not safe because they are fools. I don't know. That's a good point. I mean, even well, the advocates of a United States of Europe seem to think that whatever problems nation states had, Europe wouldn't replicate. But we have no reasons to believe that. That is, I mean, in terms of democratic accountability, yeah, however imperfect democracies at national levels have been, you have a better chance of gaining genuine democratic accountability at a national level than you have at a European level. And again, I mean, if you look at the way in which the Eurozone crisis has been dealt with, yeah, people don't have much input into that. So, yeah, what hope would one have that at the European level, democracy would work better than it does at the level of nation states? I've been following the debates in Germany quite closely, and I mentioned Jürgen Habermas, and of course he has written quite a few articles over the last 2 years advocating the United States of Europe that would be more democratic. Uh, he's also disillusioned about the kind of technocracy that is arising out of the crisis. But he never quite explains how is that going to work, even in terms of the linguistic diversity that we have. You know, like we have this seminar now, and I don't even know in how many countries participants in this seminar are based, but maybe in a dozen or so. But you are, you are the future elite. You have no problems listening to an English lecture, but can you expect that every European will be comfortable in debating European politics in English? Should you expect that? So language matters in a democracy too. Yeah.
Okay, next
Well, again,
question.
I moved somewhat away from the question, I suppose. I find it quite tricky not to see the people who ask the question. I'm
That's
talking to my computer
one of the few disadvantages, of course.
of the webinar.
If someone wants to elaborate more, they'll always have a chance to email later. So in case that
Ah, okay,
it isn't
okay.
clear. Next question from Tim, who asks, would you be so kind to estimate how the German Constitutional Court will decide tomorrow, and if they would reject or approve the ESM?
Well, I think they will approve it, but with some conditions attached. They will. It won't be that easy to justify the approval because I think that the claims against the ESM are pretty strong. It really erodes the capacity of the German parliament to control German national finances, and it potentially exposes Germany to endless obligations, basically. But they will probably argue something like they cannot take on that political role. They will argue that it has to be ensured that any transfers of money have to be backed up by the Bundestag, which can be kind of done I don't know. I am very curious. What is quite interesting is that whatever justification they will put forward, it will contradict to some extent with the justification of the Maastricht Treaty decision and the Lisbon Treaty decision. It was already in the Maastricht Treaty decision that the German Constitutional Court compiled a catalogue of competencies that must remain, must remain at national level, where the German Bundestag must have the power to decide and to control your budget. Of course, that is one of the oldest democratic rights. I mean, even the American Revolution was no taxation without representation, right? So that is the birth of democracy. And I read that reference in a couple of editorials in German newspapers, like the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. So the control over budget, as was ascertained in the Maastricht Treaty decision, is at the heart of democratic control that must not be moved to a supranational agency. And there will be a great deal of sophistry employed to show that that is not the case with the ESM. But I think personally that it is the case. Also, when you think about the possible interaction between the ESM and the European Central Bank after the announcement that Mario Draghi made that the purchases of bonds can be unlimited. So my prediction is they will say yes, but with some conditions attached, but the conditions won't be perhaps all that difficult to implement. It would be more interesting, of course, if they said no, because I expect that then the markets would go berserk. And if they don't go berserk, then one could say that the ESM is not even needed, because who cares? But yeah, it's not very likely. I think it would probably be desirable for it to say no, because that would accelerate Eurozone's demise. And Germans have that saying that I might misquote. I'm not German by birth. I just live there. I speak some German, but if there is a German listener who can correct me, please do so. There is a saying in German, es ist besser, ein Ende mit Schrecken ist besser wie ein Schrecken ohne Ende, and that means an end with now I lost my English. I end with disaster is better than a disaster without end. So
that's very well put.
It will be yes.
Next question from Ekin. I'd like to know whether you find the term EU-SSR, that implies that the EU is just another Soviet-style superstructure, whether you find it credible, or would it actually be more accurate or appropriate to compare it to Yugoslavia?
Yes, a good question. To be honest, until quite recently, I violently opposed any comparison to USSR. I mean, I grew up in communist Czechoslovakia, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks. And whatever misgivings I have about the way in which the Eurozone crisis has been handled, or whatever frustration I feel about the erosion of democracy across Europe, the EU still consists of 27 democracies. That was not the case with the Soviet Union. So, people in Europe still have much more say in the way in which they are governed. That way, I find the comparison with the USSR really overdrawn. And even former Yugoslavia, of course, was an authoritarian state. It was not as Stalinist in the 80s as was Czechoslovakia, for example, but it was as far from democracy as none of the countries in Western Europe or across Europe are now. But there is a real danger that I think we shouldn't underestimate, that the steps that are being taken are incrementally eroding democracy in Europe. as I said, we should never take liberty for granted. And I think that is also the brilliance of Hayek. I mean, the road to serfdom, to me, is as relevant today as it ever was, because democracy can be destroyed step by step. You don't have to have a communist takeover to destroy democracy. In fact, in Czechoslovakia, in my homeland, after the Second World War, there was a moment in time in February 1948 that was presented in communist historiography as the key moment. But the communist takeover occurred over 3 years, step by step. Hayek's nightmare about central planning leading to the destruction of liberty occurred between 1945 and 48 in Czechoslovakia. It didn't occur in Western Europe, thank God, but you know, it very much occurred in communist Czechoslovakia. And you know, in times of crisis, liberty becomes more fragile, I suppose. So the concern I have is very real, yet I still don't want to go as far as to compare the EU with the USSR.
Okay, there are a few questions left, so we'll try to round them up. Try to end at about 15 minutes past, 20 minutes past. Next question from Julian. Could the subsidiarity principle be important in solving this crisis? And what is your opinion on this principle?
Well, subsidiarity principle is excellent in theory and more or less useless in use practice. I remember once I attended a brilliant lecture by Joseph Weiler, who is a very distinguished constitutional scholar, who explained a decade ago or so that it doesn't help you all that much to have that principle on paper there somewhere, everywhere in EU treaties. What matters more is the way in which institutions are constructed and act. And you see, once you have this bureaucratic body like the European Commission, the tendency is to acquire more competencies, to acquire more power. So subsidiarity won't protect you against that. I mean, this is where the contest between the European Court of Justice and the German Constitutional Court is more interesting. I mean, if the German Constitutional Court was courageous enough to withstand the political pressure that is also subjected to and stand up to do what it's meant to do, that is to defend German democracy, then it would get more interesting, and then the principle of subsidiarity would get more real. But I have doubts that will be the case. So yeah, to talk about subsidiarity is not enough. We would have to have better institutionalized mechanisms in place to make it work.
Okay, next question from Minea.
Nick, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Next question from Minea, who asks, was the wrong perception of the end of the nation states in Europe a sort of European silent acceptance, and so a perceived boost of anti-national parliamentarianism behaviors of politicians, especially in the Eastern European nations?
Can you please repeat that? I'm not sure I got enough.
The question is whether the wrong perception of the end of the nation state after 1989 was a silent acceptance on part of Europeans, and thusly a boost to the anti-nationalism behaviors of politicians, of the European politicians, especially in Eastern European nations. This is how the question is framed.
Yeah, well, you see, the problem is, of course, and again, that's something that I should discuss a bit more, that the EU has always been an elite-driven project, and the elites are more transnational and European in their outlook. I mean, I myself, I don't feel such a strong attachment to my nation. I'm proud to be an Australian, maybe Slovak Australian, whatever. But for most people, nationhood still matters a great deal. Now, with 1989, Germans always believed, more than any other nation, German elites actually always believed that the only way for Germany to function is to accept its role in Europe. For Germans, for German elites, an escape from their identity was a very attractive and powerful proposition. And this is what Habermas theorized very, very clearly. But that proposition is not quite as plausible to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, to Britain, to Ireland, to Spain, to Greece, to Poland. So the elite in those countries bought into the European project, but the people never accepted that the national democracy should be abandoned in a sense and substituted with the EU democracy. Mind you, it needs to be said that the Maastricht Treaty didn't go as far as to say that that's the end of the nation state. It is just what happens when you abolish national currency. This is what the Eurozone crisis has shown very clearly, that without national currency, you no longer have full control over your destiny. Again, I'm not sure whether I satisfactorily answered that. A difficult, a very good question, but yeah, I need to think about it a bit more.
Okay, I think we can wrap up here. I'm very sorry we couldn't answer all the questions, but as usual, they began pouring in towards the end. But if you have more questions or want some more information on this topic, feel free to email me at nroskums@studentsforliberty.org. There will also be a follow-up email after this webinar, so feel free to reply to that. And if you want more information or if you want to ask an additional question. So thanks very much, Stefan, for your talk and for answering these questions. I'm sure it was enlightening to everyone here. And thank you for all your questions. And if you want to learn a bit more about European Students for Liberty, we have a book that's recently been published coming into Europe in the following days. It's called After the Welfare State, which deals with another but equally pressing matter. And we have some regional conferences coming up. For the first time in Europe, we're organizing conferences that are more decentralized, in line with our creed, in Stockholm, Belgrade, Turin, and Munich. The next webinar will be next Tuesday, and this will be the first webinar of the US SFL, and it will be organized at 2 p.m. Central European Summer Time. And we have also our first Italian webinar coming up in cooperation with SFL, which is an Italian organization of libertarian students. We are organizing webinars in Italian. First one will be called La Città Rende Liberi, and it will be organized on October 2nd. If you want to learn more about all these things, feel free to check out our website, our Facebook, and our Twitter account. So that leaves me just to thank every one of you for attending the webinar. Thank you, Stefan, for being the first speaker in this series. And I hope to see you all or hear you all very soon at our next webinar, which will feature Nigel Ashford on how to network. That will be in 2 weeks' time. Until then, take care, everyone, and hope to hear you soon.
Thank you, Nick. Bye-bye.